Hey everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our Introduction to Biblical Studies course. And today you can see we have come to my favorite suburban Cobb County hill just outside my beloved hometown of Atlanta. I am still basking in the glory of my beloved baseball team's first championship in 26 years. They last won when I was in 4th grade. I was growing up in Atlanta at the time. I had a chance to go to the third game just a couple of weeks ago, and believe it or not, this ballpark and this scene actually has something to do with what we're talking about in class today. History and archaeology. How do we use them when we're interpreting the Bible? For example, when I was at the game, this is a few hours before the game, I'm walking around and I came across this trash can with the words, "just a piece of metal" inscribed upon it. Not knowing history, we might think that's just kind of random, not important. However, knowing recent contemporary baseball history, we know those are the words the commissioner of baseball, who is not exactly beloved in Atlanta right now, those are the words he used to downplay the Astros cheating scandal when they were caught a couple of years ago cheating their way to the championship in 2017. We can therefore interpret these words on the trash can as a mockery both of the visiting team, about whom the words were said, as well as the commissioner who uttered them. The whole scene, the proper exegesis of this trash can is satire. It is ridicule. We're going to see similar things, believe it or not, in the Bible. Let's go ahead and look at our agenda for today. We're going to begin today with diachronic study. We're going to look at the historical critical method, which is the diachronic method of biblical study. We're going to look especially at the 6 operations that it comprises. Then we're going to look at how history is also relevant to synchronic study. Synchronic study, that is an analysis of the Bible that looks only at the final form of the biblical text without regard to how it evolved over time. Then we're going to look at how history is relevant to various genres that we find in the biblical canon. We begin with the historical critical method. I want to recall this distinction we introduced a few classes ago between diachronic and synchronic. The Greek for diachronic means through time. Diachronic analysis looks at how the text developed over time. This is the historical critical method. And when we say historical critical, remember, we're not saying that we're criticizing the Bible. Rather, we say that we're looking at the Bible and trying to understand it. We're trying to make judgments about it. That's what the word critical means in this context. We're trying to make reasoned judgments about the Bible in light of history. Diachronic analysis contrasts with synchronic analysis, which comes from the Greek with time, and it analyzes the final form of the text without regard to how it evolved over time. Synchronic study is going to principally include, at least in my classes, narrative analysis, which applies to narrative texts, which is a good chunk of the canon, as well as rhetorical analysis, which can apply to almost any type of literature in the canon. It looks at how the final form of the text is trying to persuade an audience. There are other kinds of synchronic analysis as well. Those two, narrative analysis and rhetorical analysis, are the two that I use extensively. Let's now look at the historical critical method. And remember, Verbum Domini teaches, building on interpretation of the Bible in the church, this method is indispensable for studying the Bible. It is not optional. That is not my opinion. That is the church's teaching. Here I'm following the exposition given by the Pontifical Biblical Commission in the 1993 document, Interpretation of the Bible in the Church. We begin with textual criticism. We learned about this in our last class. This looks at what is the original wording of the text in the original languages. That was last class. Before we go into these other 5 operations, let me say that the words that I use, the terms I use to describe each of these operations, they vary somewhat from scholar to scholar. I'm using the terms that I find most frequently used, but you will see as you read different authors slight differences. We have word study, which is what do words mean in context. This deals with grammar, syntax, morphology, all things words. Then source criticism, which is going to ask the question, did the inspired author make use of a source? Was there an earlier written text that gave rise to our current written text? Then we have form criticism, which we've already looked at, which is what is the history of this kind of literature, this little snippet, this little bit of text? Does it have an oral heritage behind it? What was its original function or setting in life? Sitzen Leben in German. Then we get to tradition criticism, which is how did this text figure into the broader stream of tradition? It's thought that you had all of these smaller bits of text that ultimately formed larger streams of Hebrew tradition in the Old Testament or different streams of the Jesus tradition in the New Testament. And then finally, redaction criticism, which looks at what emphases did the final editor or redactor, hence the name, what emphasis did this person give the text in its final form? Where do we see the editorial hand at work in telling us what the text is saying? This is diachronic study. Obviously, it is heavily historical. It's looking at what was going on in the historical background of the biblical books and is trying to understand how did the text itself evolve over time, as well as when the text is talking about things that happened historically or is giving names of people, places, and events from history, how is it using those events? Note importantly here, again, this is not optional. All of this methodology comes from what Pius XII had already taught in Divino Afflante Spiritu. You'll notice here in the colored sections of this quotation, most of these operations were already being called for in 1943 by Pope Pius XII. So here are some diachronic questions we can ask about history. One of our books differentiates between history in the text, which is how text presents history, how the text gives us a window into the world of the Bible, and contrast that with the history of the text, that is, how the text itself evolved through history. When we're looking at the history depicted in the text, we can ask questions such as, to what extent does the text narrate events from the past? To what extent does this text's description of history cohere with other historical texts of the era? Indeed, archaeology has given us a lot of other texts from the surrounding cultures of Israel, especially in the Old Testament. It's also given us all sorts of documents from the Greco-Roman world of the New Testament. All of this can help us understand how the Bible's narratives fit into the broader world history. How does this text interpret historical events? We want to pay particular attention to cause-effect relationships. This is where historians are at their greatest, most sublime work. Cause-effect relationships. This event happened because. We're going to notice in the Bible, sometimes we get different cause-effect relationships being described, especially as regards the exile in the Old Testament. In the history of the text, we can ask, does this text show an affinity with other texts in the canon? Are there similarities in the different streams of tradition? Can I trace the historical forces that may have led this inspired author to express himself in this way? To what extent does this text correspond to other texts of a similar genre from its era? Does this text show signs of having used another text as a source? All of that is the historical critical method. These are the kinds of questions the historical critical method is well equipped to answer. We see some examples. Even you look at this brief passage from the book of Joshua, in describing the day stopping, the sun stopping in the sky without the sun moving across the horizon, it's testified to in Joshua chapter 10, and the author goes to say, this is recorded in the book of Yashar. Notice that Joshua here explicitly tells you he's using a source. He says, this is recorded in the book of Yashar. Incidentally, where is the book of Yashar? No one knows, but we can see that the inspired author of the book of Joshua knew of this other book and indeed even cites it. So there's a clear case. We have other cases. Some are just that clear, others a little less so. Let's now look at how history matters in synchronic study, in narrative analysis and rhetorical analysis. And I want to begin with an important fourfold distinction. This is a frequently committed error when people interpret the Bible. First, we have when a story or poem is set. That is referring to its setting. What time frame does the world of the story or the poem take place in? That has to be contrasted with when a story or poem was written. It shouldn't be all that complicated. It's very common for us to begin stories once upon a time. Or during World War II, St. Maximilian Kolbe was imprisoned. The story is set during World War II. The story is being written or uttered right now. That same distinction applies to the Bible. Just because the book of Genesis is set 2,000 years before the birth of Jesus does not mean it was written then. This time when the text was set or written further contrasts with when it was edited. Here we're talking about how the text was transmitted. It had to be copied by hand. It had to be handed on. Good biblical interpretation explains, why did somebody copy this text? Why was it valuable enough to be preserved? Sure, the Holy Spirit was active in that process, but through what human instrumentality? We have to account for that. And then finally, when the community accepted this text as authoritative, why did they do so? Why did Israel accept this Old Testament text as authoritative? Why did the church accept this New Testament text as authoritative? So here are some questions we can ask when we're studying a text synchronically. When we're looking at prose texts, but especially narratives, does this passage allude to historical events? Why? Why is the author recalling these historical events? Does this passage, if it's set earlier in history, foreshadow some later historical incident? Hint, hint. Why is the author telling the story this way? What role does the setting play in the narrative? Here we're doing good old-fashioned story analysis. What role does the setting play? Or what role do the characters play? Which characters or persons are central? Is this always true when we read accounts of this event? And how central a concern does history seem to be in this text? Might the inspired author have narrated events in a certain sequence to make a more important point? We need to at least be open to the possibility that history is not the inspired author's primary concern. There is, at least theoretically, and we need to be open to the possibility that some type of historical fiction might be in front of us. We can't exclude that possibility a priori. If we're looking at a poetic text, why does the poet treat historical persons, places, and events? What effect does that allusion have? So let's apply these new skills to a concrete case that occurs several times within the canon. Babylon, the Mesopotamian city and civilization that eventually would exile the southern kingdom in 586 BC, and indeed had been, more than a millennium before, a great power that gave us, among other things, the Code of Hammurabi, which was influential with a lot of the legal texts in the Old Testament. Let's see how Babylon is used across the canon and why different genres might treat it differently. We've got 4 passages. Here in the book of Genesis, we hear about the origin of Babylon. Cush became the father of Nimrod, who was the first to become a mighty warrior on earth. His kingdom originated in Babylon, Erech, and Akkad, all of them in the land of Shinar. This occurs right after the flood of Noah's day, and it's giving the origin not just of these Mesopotamian cities, but also the origin of war. Here we see the inspired author shaking his fist at their imperial overlords. There's a satire going on here. This is a little bit like that trash can outside the ballpark. In the book of Jeremiah, we're getting the account of how the exile happened. This is one of the places where it occurs. Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and all his army marched against Jerusalem and placed it under siege. Here we're referring to narration of what happened in that fateful summer of 586 BC. In the Psalter, in Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat weeping when we remembered Zion. But the story is not merely historical. Notice that we have Israel praying to God that Babylon might get their just deserts. Look at this in verses 8 and 9. Desolate daughter Babylon, you shall be destroyed. Blessed the one who pays you back what you have done us. Blessed the one who seizes your children and smashes them against the rock. Clearly, Israel is expressing its emotion. It's expressing its profound grief and hunger for vindication and trust in God to bring it about. And then we have the very last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation. This grand vision that John has on Patmos. The woman was wearing purple and scarlet and adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. On her forehead was written a name, which is a mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I saw that the woman was drunk on the blood of the holy ones and on the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. Here, Babylon is a symbol of a great persecutor. Here, Babylon is symbolic, I would argue, of Rome under the Emperor Nero, who's killing Christians. That's why she's drunk on the blood of the holy ones. She's killed a lot of believers in Christ, and on the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. Witnesses, this is the martyrdom motif in the book of Revelation. The whole point is that we have to be attentive when we're reading. Not every word has the same meaning in every context in which it occurs, and this is especially true when it comes to historical allusions. So we want to be attentive to that. In our next class, we're going to look at how words are used. We're going to learn all about word study in our next class. Until then, read well and pray well.